So I figured for this fall season, we'd paint a small autumn landscape. As with all my other painting lessons on this channel, this one's painted with acrylic paints and an airbrush, and we're using erasing and scratching techniques for highlights. If you're interested in learning how to paint landscapes like this, I really hope that this lesson is helpful. Now, this painting is definitely on the difficult side, but of course I'm going to walk you through all the techniques that I used if you're going to paint along with me. And this lesson is going to be centered around painting technique, so I'm not going to include any sort of conceptual stuff or art history. With that said, let's jump right into this lesson. So on the screen now is a high resolution photo of the completed painting. Like all my recent videos, this one's in 4K, so if you set this to full screen, take a screenshot of it, you'll have plenty of resolution to use as a reference to paint along with. And like always, I included a gridded version here, so you could use this to transfer over to your paper or to your canvas. I'm painting this one directly on a piece of MDF that I cut myself, and I put about 3 layers of gesso on it. If you're going to be painting on MDF or canvas, I'll have a link to a video I made down below showing you how I set this up. And I'll have links in the video description for some papers I recommend, but make sure whatever surface you're working on, you want at least 2 layers of gesso on it so we could soft erase. Before we start this painting, the first thing we're going to need to do is mix up our first color. And for this first mixture, I'm going to be using Payne's Gray, and I'm also going to be using Cobalt Blue. The paint line I'm using is Createx Illustration Colors. This way it's going to make it much easier for us to erase and scratch the paint. After these paints are thoroughly mixed, I'm mixing about 10 parts Cobalt Blue to 1 to 2 parts of Payne's Gray. To reduce it, I'm going to add about 2 to 3 parts distilled water, and then I'm going to place this on the mini vortex mixer to mix up. And you're going to get a color that looks like this, basically a blue that's slightly desaturated with that Payne's Gray. We're going to be using this color to start painting in the sky. I'm placing a large piece of frisket onto this MDF board. This way I could use it to separate the mountain from the sky. And from here, what I'm going to do is use an X-Acto blade to cut out the contour of the mountain. For the initial drawing, I just sketched this in freehand. You don't have to be really precise and perfect with a landscape, but of course I recommend using that gridded version just to help you get everything lined up. With that color we just mixed, we're going to start painting in this sky. And when we do this, we're going to be painting in a gradient from a darker value to a lighter value. With nearly every landscape you paint, the darkest value of the sky is going to be on the top, and as you move down lower to the horizon, that value is going to get lighter. This doesn't happen 100% of the time. Sometimes clouds can affect this where you get some darker values toward the bottom, but in most cases, you're going to see dark value on top, lighter on the bottom. So what I'm doing is using that blue that we just mixed, and I'm spraying it 20 psi. You can't even see my airbrush here because I'm holding it pretty far back, about a foot away. When I hold the airbrush farther away like this, it gives me the widest part of the spray angle that's hitting the canvas, so it's easier to get a gradient from dark to light. Toward the top, I'm spraying more paint. That's going to give me a darker value, and as I get closer down to the mountain, I'm just spraying less paint, giving me a lighter value. Now this sky is going to be pretty simple. It's going to be like a clear day. We're not going to be painting any clouds in it. But the next time you go outside, look in the opposite direction of the sun, and you'll notice that the sky is generally a darker blue toward the top, and as it gets lower to the horizon, it just gets lighter. And although this is a simple example, this is one of the reasons that I love painting. It makes you see things that you may have not noticed before. It doesn't matter if I'm working on a landscape, a portrait, or a still life. I generally learn something new in every single painting. And later on in this painting, we're going to get to the water, which is a reflection of the sky. So the water is always going to have an opposite gradient of the sky. The sky goes from dark to light, and the water is going to go from light down to dark. And that's simply because it's reflecting the sky above it. Now, the color that we mix for this sky is a transparent color, meaning that we're only using that one color to get different values. We spray more for darker ones and less for lighter. Now, the only challenging thing about this is that it could be very unforgiving. If you're only using transparent colors and you accidentally spray too much paint, make it too dark, there's really no way that you could lighten it. So to make this more forgiving, what I'm going to do now is switch over to the color white, which is opaque. Any sort of white paint will work just fine for this because all whites are made from titanium dioxide, which is a very opaque color. Now, I'm going to be spraying this color right out of the bottle. I'm not going to dilute it at all, not adding any colors to it. And white, no matter what airbrush you're using, is usually a difficult color to spray just because the pigments are a bit larger in it. To make this easier for me, I'm spraying this through an airbrush that has a larger nozzle than the Micron, which I usually use. So I'm spraying this through a GSI Krios. That's a PS276, and the needle size is 0.3 millimeters. I'm also going to bump up the air pressure to around 25 psi at my compressor. As I paint in this white color, I'm basically just doing the same thing I did before, but this time in reverse. I'm spraying the white toward the bottom, and then as I move up where the values get darker, I spray less of that white paint. This is going to help give us a very smooth gradient for that sky. And this white is going to help smooth everything out and just make the sky so much easier to paint, because if you were painting with that blue color before, for it and you accidentally sprayed too much in some areas, you could just spray this white right over the top of it, knock those areas back down to light, and kind of smooth everything out. Once we have that painted in, I'm going to remove the frisket, and you're going to see that it's just going to give us a very sharp line between the mountain and the sky. From here, we're going to start painting in the mountain, and what I did was I let this sky dry overnight, and I started working on this the next morning. The reason that I let it dry for about 12 hours or so is that I'm going to be putting frisket on the area of the sky that we just painted. And when I remove it, I want to make sure that none of that paint lifts off with it. And of course, this piece of frisket is a top half when we cut the mountain out. And instead of trying to line up the whole piece of frisket across this whole mountain, you could see that I just cut off a part of it because I'm going to be working on this one small section of the mountain and then slowly work my way over to the right. So I don't need the whole piece of frisket on for now. The color that I'm going to be using to paint in the mountain is 10 parts Payne's Gray to about 2 to 3 parts of cobalt blue. And of course, I added a couple drops of distilled water into that just to help reduce it. Now this mountain is pretty far in the background, and when objects are far in the background, they usually take on a bit of the atmospheric color. So the sky that we painted in before was blue, right? It was 10 parts cobalt blue to 1 or 2 parts Payne Gray. And I wanted to keep the hue of the mountain consistent with the background. So this color mixture of around 10 parts of Payne's Gray with 2 to 3 parts of cobalt blue is still going to be a bluish color, but it's going to be a lot more desaturated, a bit more toward gray than blue. I'm starting this part of the mountain up by the frisket because generally when I'm painting with frisket, I want to get it off as quickly as possible because it's very hard to see any of the values as overspray kind of gets on the frisket. So I'm just painting around the frisket so we can get a nice sharp line between the mountain and the sky. So let me slide over the painting that we're working on now and place up my completed painting on the left side of the screen. This way you'll have a reference to compare what we're painting on now and see what we're working towards. So the area of the mountain that I'm starting with is this small peak right here. And the light source for this painting is obviously the sun, right? Because it's a landscape, it's outside. And the light source is kind of over to the left. So our highlights are going to be on the left side and then the corresponding shadows are going to be off to the right. I'm always thinking about that as I'm adding in all the shadows here because I'm making up a lot of these as I go along. I am looking at my reference, but you just can't copy every single thing in a reference. It's just too much stuff. I'm going to be using a bunch of different techniques to add texture in for this, but right now I'm using a ripped piece of paper and I'm just lightly spraying over the edge. This way I'm going to get a separation from that peak in the background to this one which is closer to us over to the right. Once I have some textures on there, I'm going to glaze a very thin layer of paint right over the top of this, and this way it's going to darken the value of that whole peak in the background. From here, I could remove the frisket film to see what this looks like against that sky that we painted in. From here, I want to define the outlines of this ridge just underneath the peak that we were just painting. So you can see I'm going around with a ripped piece of paper and just painting in these few lines. It almost looks like a triangle shape here, just the top part for now. I'm going to use the same color to glaze a thin layer of this paint over in that peak in the background, and then from there I'm going to switch over to my eraser. This is an ink eraser, and what I'm doing with it is just scratching off some paint in some of the highlights here to add some texture. For this part of the mountain just underneath the peak we painted in, there's a lot of texture here. So what I'm doing is trying out my skin texture template, and then I'm just lightly spraying this over this whole area. This way we're going to get something that looks like trees. Now in this area of the mountain, there must be thousands of trees. So I just want to get some texture in there to give the impression that we're looking at almost like a forest or something on this mountain. I'm not really concerned about what this looks like right now. I'm just trying to fill in this area, get rid of that white canvas, so we have something there to kind of work into and adjust. To paint in the rest of this ridge here, instead of placing that frisket on, I'm just using a ripped piece of paper, which has kind of an organic edge on it, placing this over and then just lightly spraying over the top. From here, what I'm doing is just filling in some textures here and some paint on this side of the canvas, basically just covering up the white gesso. From there, we have something to erase and scratch into to start pulling out some more textures. I'm going back to my ripped piece of paper just to define in some of these lines, starting with the mountain here, just to separate it from the sky and from the background. I also want to make sure that I define some of these hills and creases within this part of the mountain here. So what I'm doing is I'm going back to this ripped piece of paper and just spraying in a few lines here. These lines are going to act as transition points between highlights and shadows. Remember that the light source of the sun is slightly over to the left, so highlights are going to be on the left side and the shadows are going to be on the right. This line here is going to be kind of like an anchor point, and I'm just going to work on this small section of the hill First thing I'm doing is using my skin texture template and spraying some texture in there. I'm switching over to freehand, and what I want to do is just lightly spray in some darker values here to the right, because this part almost looks like a crevice, like it's kind of curving away from us. So I want to get it pretty dark. So just coming in freehand, going along this line, just spraying a bunch of small little dots there to help darken it up. And I'm going to follow this procedure over and over to slowly add texture to this mountain. I'm going to use my ripped piece of paper to define this shadow on the left side here. This way I have another anchor point, and I could work just in this middle section now, switching over to freehand, darkening up this area, and also adding in some texture. When I add in texture freehand, what I'm doing is basically bumping the trigger back and forth with my finger, and then kind of jiggling the airbrush around in small circular motions. This is going to give me a bunch of small little random dots, but these dots are going to be soft. And this is a different texture than what you'd get when I was using that skin texture template. When I spray through that, since it's a shield, it's always going to give me sharp, defined lines. And when I'm spraying with the airbrush like this, adding in a bunch of dots, these are going to be softer because the airbrush is spraying and atomizing the paint. So when I'm working on any sort of texture, whether it's trees on a mountain or skin pores, whatever it is, I always like to kind of randomize the textures, sometimes having some of them sharp and defined and other times softer. So I'm always going to switch off between using a shield and painting freehand. This is all personal preference. It's really up to you. If you want, you could paint in the whole thing freehand and kind of have a soft gradient between all the textures, or you could use a shield the whole time. It really doesn't matter. It's up to you. And trust me, I know that I'm going through a lot of information quickly. I might be talking too fast, but I'm just doing the best I can to try to condense all this information to keep these videos short and concise. I'm going to slow down this video to real time in a little bit so we can talk about the steps that I'm doing in a bit more detail. But you could see with what I'm doing now, it's basically just adding a bunch of textures with the airbrush and then going over to the eraser and scratching stuff out. I'm not that far into this painting. I'm probably an hour, maybe 2 hours into it at this point. And right now we could see that this almost starts to look like trees, and it looks like we're starting to build up a mountain there, especially in the background. As I said a million times, painting is just an illusion. Doesn't matter if you're using an airbrush, oil paint, acrylics, whatever. The goal is just to add down textures and values so that when the viewer looks at this from a distance, it looks like a mountain. Let's move along to this next part of the mountain, and here I'm just going to put some frisket on, and then I'm going to slow this down to real time so I can walk you through the steps that I'm doing. With this ripped piece of paper, I'm placing it at an angle, and I'm spraying directly on the paper here. I want this shadow to be very dark. If you look at the reference painting, I'm painting in this shadow right here. I'm going to add some textures in around it, just painting this in freehand and also spraying next to the frisket so we get a sharp outline along the outside of the mountain. Then I'm going to go back to the piece of paper and just spray the right side of this shadow. Every shadow is going to have a corresponding highlight, so I'm adding some paint to the left where that highlight's going to be. Later we'll switch over to an eraser and add some texture into that. Moving along to this next shadow, doing the same thing with a ripped piece of paper, spraying directly on it to give me a very sharp line. I want to continue this straight up right to the top of the mountain, so I'm placing this right on top of the frisket and spraying right over it. The frisket is going to protect the sky, so none of this dark gray paint is going to get on it. I'm going to darken this up more just by spraying some more paint on top of it. And then I'm going to do what I did before in the highlight area, which is going to be to the left of this shadow. I'm just spraying in some texture there, knowing that I'm going to switch over to my eraser later on to scratch out some highlights there, make it brighter, but also add some texture. Let's add one more ridge over to the right here using the same technique as before, just spraying over that ripped piece of paper. Then I'm going to switch to the other side of the ripped piece of paper, which has a straight edge on it. Use that to kind of mark off where that shadow is going to end. Before I take this frisket film off, I want to get rid of some of that white canvas. So I'm going to use my texture template. It's what I usually call the skin texture template because I use it on portraits. And I'm just going to place it over this area, lightly spray over it, just to kind of cover up some of that white gesso. I'm going to add one more ridge here over to the right and then add in some texture here before I remove that frisket film. From here, what we're going to do is switch over to the eraser and work right into those highlights. The eraser I'm using here is a sand eraser. These come with the Sun Dolphin erasers. I have links for those down below. And I have it kind of retrofitted into a clutch pencil. These are used to hold lead, to hold graphite. And what I'm doing is just working into the bright areas, to the highlights. Remember, the light source is left to right, so these highlights are always going to be to the left of those shadows. We already painted those in, so switching over to the eraser here, I could just start scratching out some of this paint. I'm specifically erasing in horizontal strokes, trying to follow the angles of the mountain. If I was erasing like this on a portrait, I'd probably be using small circular motions. That just helps look like skin texture or pores. But for this, I kind of want to show the eraser marks. It's going to help it make it look like the side of a cliff. When you erase with this, it's pulling out a lot of paint, but not all of it. So some of that paint that's left behind gives a very, very subtle texture. And to me, when you look at it from a distance, it almost looks like snow. Moving down to this mountain below it, I'm just going to add in some more random dots, make it look like some trees in there. I'm going to speed through some of this video because I don't want to be saying the same thing over and over. If you watch what I'm doing here, you'll understand that it's really the same process, same procedure over and over. Just like I did on the left side of the painting, I'm looking at my reference photo, and as I'm painting this, I'm just paying attention to where I see those dark shadows, kind of like those breaks in the side of the mountain where you get a dark shadow on the right and a highlight on the left. I place those in with a ripped piece of paper, and then I switch over to either freehand or using that texture template to spray some texture just around it so it kind of sets everything in place. And then from there, we just switch over to the eraser, work into that highlight area, and start removing paint. And you'll see as I'm painting here, I'm constantly switching between different erasers, from the sand eraser to a stick eraser to an electric one. And as I'm watching this video now and doing the voiceover, you really don't need all these erasers. Just a regular ink stick eraser will work just fine. You could basically do everything with that. My favorite two ink erasers are always the Staedtler Mars Razor and the Faber-Castell 7058B. They're both cheap. You can get them for a few dollars, and they do such a great job at erasing paint. And I want to point out, for this whole mountain, I'm only using that one color that we mixed before. That Payne's Gray with a few drops of cobalt blue just works great for this. And the reason that a single color will work so well for a painting is that it forces you to focus on your values. And when I say values, I'm talking about what areas are light and what areas are dark. For me, and the way I paint and draw, value is 99% of the drawing. The color for me is just kind of an afterthought. I don't really consider myself a great colorist. Some people are excellent at this. But for me, when you focus on the values, it really forces you to pay attention to what you see and to try to get everything in correctly. When I focus too much on color, I start losing track of what I see, and I think my paintings start to get messy. If you want to get more advanced with your color mixtures, I think that's a great thing. You could add some really cool effects and some nuances to any painting, shifting your color temperatures and shadows and highlights. And like always, experiment. Try different techniques, learn from different people. Put it all together so you build up your own style. Let's go back to real time so I could show you how I paint one more peak. Just like before, starting with that piece of frisket and placing it right over the top. And of course, this piece of frisket is the top half when we cut across the mountain to paint in the sky. I just took off one part of it here to place on this one peak. Same color in the airbrush, that mountain color. With a ripped piece of paper, I'm going to start spraying in the shadows first. I'm going to paint in two shadows using this shield, and then I'm going to add in a few over to the right, just painting in freehand. I'm placing in this second shadow parallel to the first one, and I want to keep these pretty light, so I'm just not pulling too far back on the airbrush, just spraying a bit of paint there so we get a very subtle shadow. To the right, there's two very small shadows next to each other, and since these are so small, I'm just painting them in freehand. This is what's nice about using a micron. It just makes this so easy to do. I'm holding the airbrush right off the surface, the needle's basically touching the panel, and I'm just pulling back the smallest amount on the trigger, just lightly spraying in a few dots of paint to make it look like a very thin line. This peak that I'm working on right now is pretty far in the background, and there's a lot of very small shadows on the left side of it. Now a shield or a piece of paper works great, but when it's really tight like this, I feel like I have a lot more control when I just paint this in freehand, so I'm just going over this area, spraying in a few thin lines. And I'm still spraying here at 20 psi, and it's kind of hard to see here, but the needle is basically just right off the canvas. It's basically touching it. A detail airbrush makes this a lot easier, but of course any airbrush will work for this. You just want to hold it really close to your paper, your panel, or your canvas. Since this area is so small, that texture template won't work so well, just because if I sprayed through it, those dots and textures would be too large for this. So again, freehand works best here. And all these little small lines and dots and textures are just going to make it look like there's something going on there. It's going to make it look like small forests way in the background, a bunch of small trees. When something's so far away like this, you can't see the detail. All you see are dark areas and light areas. And this kind of goes back to that portrait lesson a few months ago where I talked about Impressionism and explained some of the history of it. because what we're doing here is just painting the impression of what we see. So now that we have those shadows in, we're going to start erasing into it. But before we could erase into it, we need some paint there. So I'm just glazing a thin layer of this paint over the top of what we just added on, so we have something to erase into. This layer of paint is not only going to fill in the blank canvas, but it's also going to give us midtones. And the midtones are those transitional values between highlights and shadows. So let me speed through the right side of this mountain because it's really the same thing over and over, adding in some shadows, some textures, and then glazing a thin layer of paint over the top. Let's get that frisket off so we can see the surrounding values better and switch over to the eraser. I'm starting right in the middle of this small mountain with this pretty bright highlight right in the center of it. And as I'm scratching into this paint, I'm not really concerned if I erase into some of the shadow areas. It's just going to add some more texture to it, and it's not really going to affect the final painting. So when I'm using eraser, I'm definitely trying to focus on one small section of the painting, but if I erase some of the surrounding area around it, it's not a big deal because I could always switch back to the airbrush again and spray some paint over to darken it up. And I'm also using a tight hatching technique to add in some of these highlights on the left side of this mountain. That's pretty much as far as I'm going to go just on this one small mountain. What I like to do is just paint in the surrounding ones. I have that one to the left, so I want to paint that one over to the right and then kind of just compare the values, see if I need to lighten anything up or darken it. So that's where I'm going to wrap up the first part of this lesson. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. I hope you learned something. And these textures and details in the mountains are not that difficult to paint. The one thing I would say though is that they're definitely time consuming and a bit tedious. But if you pay attention to the reference painting from the beginning of the video, take your time and really focus on what you see, you can definitely paint this. Remember to never rush and try to enjoy the process of painting because in the end, that's what's going to make it worthwhile. Thank you to all the new subscribers and welcome to the channel. And of course, I want to thank the generous support of the channel members. That includes Andrew, M. Shibley, Robert, Ken, Pete, Dwayne, and a special thank you to the newest members who both joined at Tier 3. Very generous of you guys. That's Carl and Mackie Mark. And Mark, that's really great that you just got into fine art and starting to learn. I think you're going to absolutely love the process. For me, the aspect of learning while creating a painting is really what makes the whole process so much fun. And as I said earlier in the video, I learned something new in every single painting. And for all you new painters, just keep at it. I promise you that you're going to learn more and more with each painting you complete. So that's it for this video. I'll be back here next week and we'll start working on the trees. Thanks again for watching.